In 1971, on a Sunday night, Richard Nixon went on television and said something had changed. He described it as temporary. It was never reversed. That decision, made in 17 minutes, is still inside every salary, every mortgage, every pension account in the world today. And in 2022, something else changed. Quietly, without announcement. The same institutions that spent decades telling you gold was obsolete began buying it at a rate not seen since the 1960s. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why, and why they haven't explained it. To understand what is happening now, we need to go back to a resort hotel in New Hampshire. The year is 1944. The war isn't over yet, but the Allied powers are already designing what comes after. 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods with a single purpose: to build a financial system that would never allow the monetary chaos of the 1930s to happen again. The solution they constructed was built on one central premise. Every participating currency would be pegged to the US dollar. The dollar in turn would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. Any nation could exchange their dollars for gold at that rate. The system was anchored in metal. It was, for a time, the most stable monetary arrangement the modern world had ever seen. For more than 2 decades, global trade expanded, economies rebuilt, and the dollar was trusted because it was redeemable, not by faith, by metal stored in Fort Knox. Then the cost began to mount. Korea, Vietnam, domestic programs on a scale that hadn't been attempted before. By the late 1960s, foreign governments had begun to notice the arithmetic. The United States was printing more dollars than it held gold to back. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began converting French dollar reserves into physical gold, shipping it back to Paris. He wasn't alone. By 1971, the United States held enough gold to cover roughly 1/4 of the dollar claims held by foreign governments. The promise was real. The reserves were not. Something had to break. And on that Sunday night in August 1971, it did. The promise was suspended. The anchor was cut. What came next, most economic textbooks describe as a smooth transition. Some historians describe it differently. And that difference is what this video is about. Here is the distinction that matters. And it's the reason this story is still unfinished. When a currency is anchored to gold, its supply is constrained. Not perfectly. Governments can still borrow, still overspend, still manipulate. History shows they always do. But there is a ceiling, a visible limit. And when governments approach that limit, the breaking of the promise is legible, public, accountable in some form. When a currency is anchored to nothing but confidence, no such ceiling exists in the same form. Money can be created in any quantity. Debt can be expanded indefinitely. Crises can be addressed by creating more of the very thing that caused them. And markets are not always patient. For 50 years following 1971, the patience held, the dollar remained dominant. Global trade continued to flow through dollar-denominated systems. Central banks held dollars as their primary reserve asset. The system, by most visible measures, worked. But a closer examination of those 50 years reveals a different pattern. Financial crises recurred with increasing frequency. Each crisis was met with the same response: more money creation, lower interest rates, expanded central bank balance sheets. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from under $1 trillion in 2007 to roughly $9 trillion by 2022. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, all expanded by comparable multiples. Global debt, measured as a percentage of economic output, reached levels in 2020 not seen since the Second World War. These are not accusations of wrongdoing. They are entries in central bank reports, available to anyone who reads them. What they describe is a system that has been continuously expanded to absorb the consequences of its own instability. Each wave of money creation delayed a reckoning. It did not resolve one. Every wage, every pension, every savings account has existed inside that system, absorbing its costs in ways that are distributed quietly across millions of people over decades. And then, beginning around 2022, something in the data changed. Something that the institutions managing this system chose not to announce. Something that only becomes visible when you look at what they are doing rather than what they are saying. Central banks began buying gold, not in modest diversification quantities, at historically unprecedented volumes. In 2022, official sector gold demand reached the highest level in recorded history, over 1,000 tons in a single year. 2023, 2025, the buying continued at similarly elevated levels. The purchasers were not the traditional Western gold accumulating nations. The most significant buyers were the central banks of China, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore, and a collection of emerging market economies that had spent decades building dollar-denominated reserve positions. Russia's experience provided context that central bank officials across multiple countries acknowledged publicly. When Russian foreign exchange reserves held in Western financial institutions were frozen in 2022, the international financial community witnessed something instructive. Approximately $300 billion in sovereign reserves, assets accumulated over decades, stored in the currencies and institutions of allied nations, became inaccessible overnight. Gold held domestically was unaffected. It cannot be frozen. It does not run through any payment system. It has no counterparty. That fact was noted explicitly in official statements by central bank governors in countries that had never previously described gold as a strategic priority. Gold prices in 2025 surpassed $5,000 per ounce for the first time in recorded history. The gain over the preceding year exceeded 60%. Central bank demand, investor demand through exchange-traded funds, and retail accumulation all contributed. But the structural driver, the reason analysts distinguish this rally from previous cycles, is the behavior of sovereign institutions. The entities most responsible for maintaining confidence in paper monetary systems are in measurable quantities, shifting their own reserve compositions toward an asset that exists outside those systems. They have not explained why. No press conference, no policy statement, no published rationale, only the numbers, reported in quarterly reserve disclosures, available to anyone who reads them carefully. There is a long tradition in monetary history of reading institutional behavior rather than institutional statements. When the Bank of England raised rates in 1931 while publicly insisting the pound was sound, the markets read the action correctly. When French institutions began accumulating gold in the late 1960s, the academic consensus at the time held that gold was becoming irrelevant. The institutions were making a different calculation. Some historians argue that the most reliable signal of what financial institutions believe is never what they announce. It is what they quietly acquire. In 1933, the United States government required citizens to surrender their gold. The official rationale was economic stability. The order remained in effect for 40 years, lifted quietly in 1974 with little ceremony. In 1971, the government suspended the international convertibility of the dollar to gold. The official description was temporary. It was not restored. In both cases, the change in the relationship between citizens and a particular form of stored value occurred without extended public debate. The rules changed because the system required them to change. This is not offered as an argument for a particular financial decision. It is offered as a description of how monetary history actually moves. Not through announcements, but through accumulations. Not through explanations, but through actions taken quietly by institutions with the clearest possible view of where things stand. Every generation has lived inside a monetary system that felt permanent. Every generation has discovered eventually that it was not. The Bretton Woods system was described as the permanent foundation of post-war finance. It lasted 27 years. The post-Bretton Woods dollar system has lasted 54 years. It shows in certain measurable data points signs that its custodians are hedging against its continuity. What gold represents in this context is not a prediction. It is a pattern. 5,000 years of human beings, across disconnected civilizations, reaching independently for the same metal when they needed a store of value that no authority could debase and no institution could freeze. Whether that pattern is rational, superstitious, or simply persistent is a question historians debate. What is not in debate is that the pattern is repeating, and this time the entities repeating it are the central banks themselves. At the beginning of this video, we asked why the central banks that spent decades describing gold as obsolete are now buying it at a pace not seen since the 1960s. The answer is not in any official statement. There is no official statement. The answer is in the data, in the quarterly disclosures, in the tonnage figures, in the reserve compositions of 37 central banks that shifted their behavior in the same 3-year period, in the same direction, without coordination and without explanation. They know something. The numbers suggest they have known it for a while. What they know, and what they have chosen not to say, is a question that monetary history eventually tends to answer. The answer always arrives. The only variable is whether it arrives quietly or not. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.